Today, we become legends.
In the closed alpha 3 patch of Smite 2, Hi-Rez identified an issue that cooldown rate was underperforming across the board in builds, regardless of the item CDR was on. With Smite 2 moving to an uncapped CDR system instead of Smite 1's capped CDR system, there were bound to be balance issues until a good spot was found for the new system of CDR. In CA3, all cooldown rate on all items in the game was buffed by roughly 50%. Items with 10 CDR became items with 15, items with 20 became items with 30, etc. This was an absolutely massive change, as despite cooldown rate now having diminishing returns on the cooldown percentage that it gives you, being able to achieve cooldown rates 50% higher than what you could before was game changing. For example, if you managed to reach 100 cooldown rate before the patch in your build, that's equivalent to 50% cooldown reduction. Here's the formula for that if you're interested. After the CA3 patch, that became 150 cooldown rate, which is equivalent to 60% cooldown reduction. 10% CDR might seem like a relatively small change, but let me quickly explain how cooldown rate and percent cooldown reduction work. Cooldown rate has diminishing returns on how much cooldown percent it gives you. 50 cooldown rate is 33% reduction, while 100 cooldown rate is 50% reduction. You gain 33% for the first 50 cooldown rate, but only a further 17% for the next 50. Going to 150 cooldown rate is 60% reduction, only a further 10% compared to 17% before, etc. This keeps going infinitely and approaches zero value at massive cooldown rates. So cooldown rate has diminishing returns on how much cooldown percent it gives you. However, cooldown percent has exponentially increasing returns on how many abilities you can cast in a same amount of time. Think about it this way. You have a 10-second cooldown ability. You can cast that ability 6 times a minute. Now let's say you have 20% cooldown reduction. The cooldown is now 8 seconds and you can cast it 7.5 times a minute. Now you go to 40% cooldown reduction. It has a 6-second cooldown and you can cast it 10 times a minute. What about 60% cooldown reduction? Well, now it has a 4-second cooldown and you can cast that same ability 15 times a minute. 80% cooldown, 2 seconds, and you can cast it 30 times a minute. So percentage cooldown exponentially increases in value, approaching infinity, which is why it had to be hard capped in Smite 1. Since cooldown rate diminishes towards 0 in terms of how much cooldown percent it gives you, but cooldown percent exponentially increases in value towards infinity, these two effects basically cancel out to make the graph of cooldown rate to ability cast per time into a straight line. It's a linear increase. To put it another way, buying more cooldown rate gives you more ability casts at the same value no matter how much you had before. This is different to Smite 1, where buying more cooldown reduction gave you more value the more you already had, hence why it needed a cap, and why 80% cooldown match of the days felt way more than 2 times as hectic as standard 40% cooldown matches. All that mechanical preamble is just to set up why cooldown rate actually doesn't have diminishing returns in practice the way many people think it does. Sure, it has diminishing returns on the cooldown percent it gives you, but it's actually linear in terms of how many more ability casts per unit of time it gives you. Because of this, it has to be balanced very carefully, and increasing all cooldown rate in the game by 50% is not particularly careful. Because it's a linear relationship, giving everyone 50% more cooldown rate means they cast abilities 50% more often, or 1.5 times as much as they were before CA3, assuming the same build. In reality though, if you buff cooldown this much, then people who know what they're doing start building even more cooldown than they were before, so in real terms this was more than a 50% increase in how many abilities were flying around per second in your average Smite 2 match. It didn't help that the same patch that made this change introduced Baron and Yamoja, 2 gods that abuse cooldown the most of any in the game, but this was felt across the entire game. And before we even got to the next major Smite 2 update in CA4, they released a hotfix which partially reverted these changes. Items that were previously 20 cooldown rate and went to 30 were now 25. Items that were previously 15 and went to 25 were now 20. They basically halved the changes they made so that cooldown was only increased in the game by around 25% instead of 50% like before. Other than specific nerfs to some cooldown items, this is how the game has been since this mini patch. There's been no complete revert or sweeping change to CDR availability since then, but there's been a lot of people in the community, especially pro players, that have been bringing up this topic lately and saying that the CDR buffs from CA3 were a mistake. Anecdotally, it definitely does feel like cooldowns are lower in general than they were in Smite 1, but let's take a look at the numbers. Of course, Smite 1 had a much simpler system of items just having either 10% or 20% cooldown reduction with a cap of 40%, so it's very easy to quantify. The vast majority of the time, an ability-based character would want to max out their 40% cooldown reduction every game, and this was usually done through 3 items. A 20% cooldown item and 2 10% cooldown items. For example, Jotun's Wrath for 20%, then Hydras and Bombers for 10% each, or Pendulum of Ages for 20%, then Spear of Deso and Staff of Muradin for 10% each, or Pribwin for 20%, then Glad Shield and Genji's Guard for 10% each. You get the picture. It was, of course, possible to hit the cooldown cap with just 2 20% items, like going Pendulum and Chronos Pendant, but it was far more common to see 1 20% item and 2 10% items for your max cooldown. Now let's compare that to Smite 2 under the current cooldown rate values. To hit 40% cooldown reduction in Smite 2, you need roughly 65 cooldown rate. The exact number is 66.66 recurring, but it's a tiny difference that won't actually matter in practice. To achieve 65 cooldown rate, the most common routes are likely going to be either 2 25 cooldown rate items plus 1 15 cooldown rate item, or 1 25 cooldown rate item plus 2 20 cooldown rate items. The numbers aren't directly comparable to Smite 1 though. Most 20% CDR items have 25 cooldown rate, like Jotun's, Breastplate of Valor, and Chronos Pendant, but Pridwin, for example, only has 20 despite being a 20% cooldown item in Smite 1. The same is true for 10% cooldown items. Shield of the Phoenix and Soul Gem, for example, have 15 cooldown rate, but Glad Shield and Genji's Guard have 20, despite all of these items being 10% CDR in Smite 1. So yeah, the numbers aren't directly comparable, but we can at least roughly see that 65 cooldown rate is achievable pretty easily in 3 items, similar to Smite 1. And in fact, you can't get to 65 cooldown rate with just 2 items like you could in Smite 1. The most you can get is 50. So if anything, hitting the CDR cap of Smite 1 within Smite 2 is a little harder, but of course the issue comes in the fact that CDR is no longer capped in Smite 2. And if you can achieve 65 cooldown rate in 3 items, a rough theoretical maximum with a 7 item build will be 150 cooldown rate. That is equivalent to 60% cooldown reduction, and as we mentioned earlier in the nerdy math section you probably skipped, going from 40% CDR to 60% is a much bigger jump in casts per second, compared to going from 20% CDR to 40%. This is why release Sphinx Bauble in Smite 1 broke the game so much. It was only 20% extra cooldown, but because it scales exponentially, it made an enormous difference. So where does that leave us? Is cooldown rate too high in Smite 2? Well, there's sort of 2 answers to that, and we may need a more nuanced solution than just reverting the CDR patch. In terms of getting to a reasonably high cooldown percent equivalent to Smite 1's 40% cap, it's actually weaker than Smite 1. But because of the way the new CDR system works, it allows you to push beyond that, and that's where the game starts breaking down as you approach cooldown percents that are 50%, 60%, even higher sometimes. You could just solve this by nerfing CDR across the board, but that would make it so builds with just a bit of CDR are even weaker, which is not ideal when you consider that it's already harder to hit 40% cooldown reduction in Smite 2 than it was in Smite 1. If you think CDR was already OP in Smite 1, then this change is probably fine, but if you are happy with how CDR scaled in Smite 1, then this isn't the best way. So I think a change in the formula of how cooldown rate converts to cooldown reduction might be a better way to approach it. Tweak the formula to where smaller amounts of cooldown rate are mostly unaffected in how much cooldown percent it gives you, but larger amounts are punished more heavily than they are now. I'm no math wizard, and this is beyond me in terms of figuring out a formula that would work for what I'm suggesting here, but I'm sure it's doable and would fix the problem in a more complete way than just reverting the CDR patch, which also hurts normal builds that don't spam CDR on almost every item and aren't particularly a problem right now in my opinion. What do you think though? Is CDR too strong or are people overreacting? Would you prefer my solution or just reversing the CDR patch because it's too strong in general, not just at the top end? Let me know down below and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day and peace out, you nerds.